Welcome or welcome back to the Chai Academy. Glad you're with us today. We are in middle of a course, different subjects each lesson, on self-help, the Jewish approach, self-help. And self-help is a broad category, and we then divide it into sub-categories. So, hello, Eileen. So, yesterday we were talking about one type of self-help. How do you recover from trauma, manage trauma at the very least. Today's class is a fascinating question out there, and we're going to attempt to try and answer. And this is actually a conundrum that many people have, and if you don't have it, there's probably something wrong with you, or you're very wise. And when should you be flexible? When do you stick to your guns? Right? A principled person, right, and is principled, and that's a beautiful thing. It's important to be principled. But is there a time to let it go? And a very flexible person, is there time to be principled? Is flexible to be confused with a weak spine, wishy-washy? And is principled mean you have strong convictions? How do we know when to be what to be when? So essentially, when is stubbornness a good thing? When is stubbornness a bad thing? So there's a Talmud, a fascinating Talmud, that says something as follows: La'olam, always, la'olam adam, a person should always be rach, soft, like a reed, rather than being strong and hard like a cedar. Right? Rach. But so when a reed is very, very soft, etc., and a cedar is very, very strong. And the Talmud explains, kind of fleshes it out. He says there was this reed planted next to this cedar, or cedar planted next to the reed. And the reed was this, nebuchal. It was like this small little reed, which rhymes with weed. And then there was this tall cedar tree that was strong, impressive. It had a large trunk, and it had branches, and it had greenery, and it was just overwhelming the reed. And the Talmud says that the cedar looked at the reed and said, pipsqueak. And the reed shuddered when the cedar spoke to him. And then a tsunami hit. A tsunami. Huge wind, waves, storm. And when the storm was over, the cedar had toppled, but the reed remained upright. Said the cedar to the reed as it was dying, "What happened? How can I, the tough, big, tall reed, fell and you didn't?" So the reed said, "You stood your ground. You didn't sway whatsoever. You didn't move at all. And therefore you were felled. You were uprooted. Me, I'm a reed. And the wind blew north, I blew north. South, south. East, east. West, west. Was it difficult? It was extremely difficult. But did I survive it? Yes. Why did I survive it? Because I was more flexible than you." It's a very, very, very telling Talmud. And therefore the Talmud concludes you should be flexible, pliable, soft as a reed, and not be like the cedar, the brute cedar. Very, just an amazing discussion the Talmud has. And there's another piece of Talmud where it was Rabbi Gamliel. He was on a ship and he sees a shipwreck. And his heart went faint. He sees the ship like in pieces in the sea. And he looked at the ship and he saw that it was the great Rabbi Akiva's ship. And he said, "Oh my goodness, Rabbi Akiva's lost." And he wept bitterly. Heavy heart, he came back to shore. He went to the house of study. And who did he see as he walked in? Rabbi Akiva. So he says, Akiva, you had a shipwreck. How did you survive? So Akiva said two things. I held on to a board, a hard piece of wood. I held on for dear life, right? I think that's what people do. And if I remember the Titanic, right? They held on to boards. I got on top of the board. So I held on to the board. And when each wave came, I ducked my head. I bowed my head. That's the story. Between that Talmud and this Talmud, I think we can learn incredible lessons from him. But let's move to now from the Torah. The Torah tells us that there were 10 plagues, and Moses warned Pharaoh for each one. And then when the Pharaoh didn't listen and the plague continued, Pharaoh begged him to stop. Moses stopped it, and then Pharaoh still didn't listen, etc. So fast forward to Barad. Fast forward to hail. Right? So the Torah tells us that Moses warned. Moses says it's going to destroy all your crop, everything. It's just going to destroy. And Pharaoh didn't listen, and the hail came down, and the Torah tells us it destroyed everything. The flax and the barley were destroyed because it was an early growth. It already started to grow, whereas the wheat and the spelt was spared. The Torah then continued. Hold that. The Torah then continues that Pharaoh said to Moses, "Please pray for me," and Moses says, "I will, even though I don't think it's going to change anything. You don't believe in God, and you still haven't learned your lesson, but I will," and he did. Pharaoh requested, he did. Nachmanides asks a question. What does that line about spelt, wheat, barley, flax, why is it there? Right? And if you're going to talk about spelt and wheat, why don't you talk about apple trees? Why don't you talk about oats? Right? Oat lives matter. Right? Why don't you talk about other stuff? Why this? And who was talking? Who said the flax and the barley was destroyed, but the wheat and spelt weren't? Who was talking? So Nachmanides says it was Moses teaching Pharaoh a lesson. Moses was telling Pharaoh, look, take a look outside. Look out of your window. Pharaoh, you'll see, being strong and stubborn, you get destroyed. When your wheat and spelt, they're just beginning to grow and you're pliable, it didn't get destroyed. So Moses was teaching Pharaoh that lesson. So he didn't have to talk about the other trees. It was a specific lesson. He showed him the crop. So we learn from here is that we have to be pliable. We have to be flexible. And we learn another lesson is that Moses was very respectful to Pharaoh. Yes, even though you haven't, I will pray to God, even though you haven't learned your lesson. So how with all these stories of Rabbi Akiva and the cedar and this, where are we going with this? So there's two ways to be, or there's a few ways to be. There's a person could be principled. Let's take a parent, right? It could be a parent that doesn't want their child is doing something that's completely off, and they tell the child once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, and then finally the parent blows up and says, this has got to stop, and yada yada yada, and starts punishments, and if you do this, if you do that, and the relationship is destroyed. Then there is the parent that is basically the unknown, is not really involved, or permissive parenting, just lets the child do anything, so wishy-washy. Right? What is the best way to be? Right? Should you be like the cedar, or you should be like the reed? So what's interesting is the cedar had roots. The roots were hard, the trunk was hard. The reed, the leaves were flexible, but it had roots, which were hard. Which teaches us that we really should be like a reed. And a reed is a hybrid of where one should be. If you are going to lose your relationship with this child, then your stubbornness to say it's my way or the highway, or it's God's way or the highway, may not be the smartest thing. Yes, you're deep-rooted. You're not doing it. Your child is doing it. But because your child is doing it and it's your child, then maybe bend a little bit. Maybe be somewhat a little flexible. Right? We learn actually a big difference between two great generals. One was MacArthur. He was World War II, and he was in Japan, etc. So the story is that he told his men we're going to retreat, but he didn't. So he said, we're going to retreat. That's a sign of defeat. So he goes, no. We're just attacking from the other direction. So he knew when to come back and be flexible and learn to live another day. Napoleon, when he was told that the Russian, it's too big and the Russians are approaching, and he says, look at the map, Napoleon, if we don't retreat, we're going to be destroyed, and they're so close. Napoleon said, get a larger map, and they won't feel so close. There's the difference. MacArthur knew when to hold him. He knew when to fold him. Napoleon was, I'm going to be the conqueror of this part of Europe. I'm going to conquer it. There's no ifs or buts, and therefore I'm not retreating for nobody. And we all know the rest of the story is Napoleon was defeated, and the great Napoleon Bonaparte, who ruled much of the world, was over. His reign was over. His legacy was over. Why? Get a bigger map. That's why. So a person has to realize that sometimes being principled is not about the principle, but it's more about the ego. I'm involved with a parenting group, and this woman was talking at this group, and she said as follows, that her daughter was getting married, and she's from Hasidic stock, and the woman invited her whole family and her friends to the chuppah, to the wedding, etc. And the Hasidim are very modest. They come to the chuppah, and because her daughter is no longer Hasidic, she was wearing a very revealing wedding dress. Right? She wasn't dressed all the way to here and etc. And the woman said, my family were looking at me, were saying, wow, they were shocked. And they said, we feel bad. And they were saying Mazel Tov, almost like, it must be very hard for you. It must be very difficult for you. And the friends came in and they were blown away that this daughter who was brought up in such Hasidic schools would actually show parts of her that in the Hasidic world is never shown. And the mother said, what they didn't realize is they felt pity for me because of my daughter. They never asked me how I felt. They were cedar, rigid. Oh my goodness, this is terrible. I feel bad for the mom. She goes, it was the happiest moment of my life. My daughter's getting married. A little more clothing, a little less clothing. She's getting married. This is my daughter, my love, my sweetie, my mazinka, my whatever. And she goes, it was the happiest day of my life. So while friends and family, she says, I did the godly thing and maintained a relationship with my daughter. And I still have my relationship with God. So, it says that we're created in God's image, right? Which means we have to be godly. That doesn't mean that we are created, that God, that it's our image of God. We're created in God's image. God's image. Not our image of God. It's not how we envision God. God knows when to be flexible. God knows when to be principled. And sometimes you have to have both. And sometimes you have to go sway this way and that way. To be stubborn all the time is absolutely wrong, and it's ego. Oh, well, I'm doing this for the sake of, God. Maybe God doesn't want, right? Maybe God doesn't want you to do that. Maybe God would rather that you still talk to your kids or whatever it may be. And that's what Rabbi Akiva meant. Rabbi Akiva meant was, I held on to the board. The board is stiff. The board is not flexible. He says, but I went with the waves. I bowed my head. I didn't try and fight the waves. I went with the waves. I acknowledged the waves. I worked with them. That's the meaning of Rabbi Akiva. That's what he was telling Rabbi Gamliel. So it's not that, I hate you, wave, and wave. I love you. I'm going to ride with you. I'm going to ride with you. And all will be good. And all was good. He survived the shipwreck. They tell an unbelievable story. And actually, you saw it. If you saw Ushpizin, the movie, and they tell a story about a man who it was actually in Russia. It wasn't in Israel. But a man who he loved the mitzvah of etrog, to get the lulav and etrog, but he loved the etrog. And he used to spend an incredible amount of money on the esrog. And one time, there was inflation, and prices were very high. So he said, "How am I going to get an esrog?" And he went, "I don't have this type of money even to buy." So what he did, he goes, "Look, it's Erev Sukkot now. Sukkot is tonight. I need this lulav and etrog for tomorrow." He goes, "I don't need my tefillin for 9 days. I'll figure it out." So he went and sold his precious tefillin, and he bought the most beautiful esrog, the nicest one. And he brought it home, and he placed it on the counter, and he went to get ready for Yom Tov, built the sukkah, take a shower, whatever it was. And he comes back, he sees his wife, and he says, "Honey, I got an incredible esrog." She goes, "How did you afford it?" He goes, "Well, I figured I don't need tefillin for 9 days, so I sold my tefillin. The mitzvah of the day is esrog, and I need the esrog." So the wife says, "What you going to do? After Sukkot is over, what you going to do?" So he goes, "I don't know. I have to figure it out. You're right. But right now, let me show it to you." He goes to the counter, and it's no longer there. No longer there. And he turns to his wife and goes, "Where's my esrog?" She turned pale, and she said, "It's in the salad. I thought it was a lemon, and I cut it up, and I put it in the salad. It didn't have much to it. It was a thick peel, but I cut the guts out, and I put it on the cell, and I squeezed as much as I could. Yeah, it was a hard one, but I can't believe it. So she goes, you have no tefillin, you have no esrog, and she started to shake and cry. What he did at that moment was he went to her and he gave her a hug. And he kissed her. Hug, embraced her, and he said, I love you. So she turned to him and she said, you have no esrog for this holiday. You have no tefillin for this holiday. Aren't you furious at me? So he said, esrog is a mitzvah. Tefillin is a mitzvah. Loving your wife is also a mitzvah from God. And that's the mitzvah that's needed right now, is for me to show you love. So he could have been, this is, you ruined my life. You took my mitzvah from God and commit an infraction, a sin, by yelling at his wife and making her feel like garbage. But it wasn't about him. He had his eye on the prize. What would God tell me to do right now? God would tell him, not what his emotions are. God would tell him, be pliable. It's a mitzvah to love your wife. So, he may not have had tefillin. He may not have had esrog. But he had a good relationship with his wife. And he had a darn good salad. Most expensive salad on his block. So, I mean, that what an incredible story. What an incredible story. So, we always have to remember that we're created in God's image, and we have to think, what would God want from us now? Does God want us to be, flexible or rigid? So, yes, we shouldn't compromise our own values, right? But if God supersedes, and if God says, or if the Torah is clear, or if the Jewish law is clear, or Jewish philosophy is clear, that now is the time not to be hot-headed. Now's the time not to be so rigid. Now's the time to see the bigger picture, right? And be a godly, then do just that. And that's what Moses was telling Pharaoh. He says, Pharaoh, take a look. Your stubbornness destroyed everything. You're a king. You are the strongest country in the region. You had all the food. You have high walls. You have a massive economy. And because of your stubbornness, and by the way, this was Moses' adopted grandfather, because of your stubbornness, and Moses had respect, because it wasn't about him, it was about God. Because of your stubbornness, you've lost it all. If you would have been a little bit more like the flax, right, or like the barley, maybe you could have salvaged something. But instead, you are the most rigid person, stubborn, and you destroy everything. I've heard this in the name, I think it was the third Lubavitcher Rebbe who said, the difference between children and adults is, the reason why children can fight with a child and then make up a minute later, where adults fight, they don't talk to their sibling for 25 years, is because a child would rather choose happiness. An adult would rather choose I'm right over happiness. But that is ego. I say, you just say, okay, let it go. Let it go. So the answer is, you can be flexible and you be principled at the same time. And it's not a sign of weakness. In fact, to be flexible may even be a sign of tremendous strength. That while this goes against your grain, you need to do this for the greater good. Right? The Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev, he one time on Yom Kippur got up, middle of the synagogue, it was Yom Kippur, and he made Kiddush, and he drank wine. well, why? He says there are so many people sick with this plague or that plague. So even if you're not sick, you need your strength, and now's not the time to fast. So Rabbi Yitzchak was righteous. Rabbi Yitzchak was meticulous in every single law, and you better believe that he didn't take any shortcuts whatsoever. But that Yom Kippur was a time to be flexible in order to preserve life. And the same is true in order to preserve a relationship with your spouse, relationship with your children, a relationship with friends, mentors, colleagues. Is sometimes you just got to swallow. You got to know when to hold them and know when to fold them. And if you're ever in a dilemma, I've heard, who says dilemma anyway? If you're ever in a dilemma, right, you have to ask yourself, what's godly? Not me, what's godly? Right? What's godly? It says in, I think it's Tehillim Psalms, it says, I am Hashem and I do not change. Right? When Hashem created this world, he created flexibility from the onset. It's not something new. It's not progressive. Right? It's not something right? I think I've told you this. The Baal Shem Tov said, somebody came to the Baal Shem Tov, lived hundreds of years ago, who said to the Baal Shem Tov, my child is no longer religious. Should I throw him out of the house? And the Baal Shem Tov said, love him more. This is hundreds of years ago. The man had the wisdom and the foresight to understand that conventional wisdom back then was to throw your kid out. Get lost. Right? You're a scourge. You're a blight on my family. Get lost. Baal Shem Tov says, no. And now we're a much more accepting people. But it took a while to get here, and the Baal Shem Tov got it, though. He got it. So, we've talked about, children and flexible, etc. But this is true in everything. You want your partner to stay. You want to have a better relationship with employees or employer, etc. You gotta know, when there's a red line, and is the red line based on ego, or is the red line based on God or the right thing? So, because if you're too stubborn, like Pharaoh, you can destroy everything. Thank you for listening. You can see a recap on Facebook of this class. Not too many comments today. But please share. Please share, especially if you enjoyed it. Please share. And you could find this class at thechaicenter.com/academy, along with hundreds of other classes. God bless. Shoot me an email or WhatsApp. Let me know what you thought.